And more recently, I co-managed the construction documents for this $400 million mixed-use project with 2 million square feet of retail parking structure and fireproofed steel frame mid-rise office space, all together with over 1,200 tons of steel framing. So that's just a little bit about my background. Now we have a website. On the right side, you can both zoom right into the hyperlinks, use them to get more information. On the left side, you'll find all kinds of additional information, such as technical articles and PowerPoint, and you can actually watch the DVD online. But let's just get right into it. 9/11. The sound of this just brings many Americans right back to what was for us a terror-filled morning, in which we experienced what? The same thing the Iraqis did, not to that scale perhaps, but we'd never been attacked before like this, like Pearl Harbor, I think, in the World War II. So most of us just haven't experienced this. We're placed in a state of shock. We have 2 planes hitting the towers. We didn't know when the next plane was coming. All of us, this is right out of the blue. And what we were experiencing was cognitive dissonance, where competing realities are putting us in a state of shock, and we're accepting the answers that come, in the case of 9/11, within 1 or 2 days. The official story about who did this, what happened to these towers. We accept those answers because we are in a state of infantile regression when we're under attack. So we're very, very likely to accept what we're told, and it was very painful, and we do not want to go back into that pain. So it's very difficult to get people to come and to look at this evidence, whether it makes sense or not, because this takes us right back to that terror. Especially in New York, people just will not talk to you about this. It's extraordinary. Well, maybe the 9 years since has given us a chance to step out from that trance, look at the relatively new evidence that's come out in just the last couple of years. So that's what we're hoping. There's been enough time. Let's revisit the destruction of these 3 World Trade Centers. As one of our mentors, Joe Princiota, points out, to identify the perpetrator, first know the crime. And this is what we look at with architects and engineers from 9/11/2. The evidence found at the crime scene and the eyewitness testimony. And then we're asking for an investigation that lets the chips fall where they may. So let's proceed. Find out what happened right away that morning, how this myth developed, and see what we can learn from it.
On September 11, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
for those of you who are hearing chuckling and not sure why, ask yourself if it might have something to do with the fact that this gentleman is the first one interviewed on the street, wearing the Fox News hat, has the answer, what became the official answer to the reason these towers came down, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. I mean, everybody else is in shock, you know, horror. And here's this gentleman saying, I witnessed. I mean, who talks like this? So, you know, there is fodder here for some of you who prefer conspiracy theories, but I'm just trying to keep you up to date with some of the facts. Now let's see what the official story is. Whoops. The official story tells us that the buildings came down due to jet plane impacts, and right from the guy on the street. But that aside, let's take a look and try to determine, with the scientific method, how the towers were brought down. We have been given this in the last 100 years and developed it to a fine science. We want to know what brought the towers down. We formulate that question. Did they come down by fire? Did they come down by controlled demolition or jet plane impacts? We put that question into a mill. We process it with doing background research. We make observations. How have other skyscrapers been destroyed? We construct a hypothesis, our best guess. And then we make predictions based on that hypothesis and test those predictions with experiments. Now, we analyze the results and draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner for all to see, so that the body of work that we do can be built and worked with by others. And we'll find that NIST failed miserably with every one of these steps. And if our hypothesis is not corroborated, for instance, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the data, the experiments, the research. So with that in mind, let's apply the scientific method and find out how have buildings been destroyed. NIST did not do this research. There's a whole number of ways that they're destroyed. Fire is certainly one. Natural collapses, where buildings will collapse, fall over. Explosions are certainly a characteristic of one way of destroying buildings, and they can be harnessed in controlled demolitions to bring down buildings. Now, each of these has a very different and identifiable characteristic, features. We can tell fires from controlled demolitions from other natural collapses. So with that in mind, let's just start with fires. They're organic by their nature. Fires will burn through a building, an office building, in just 20 minutes in a certain area and moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources, leaving the area burned out to cool. And so when a building does collapse, and by the way, you'll note that never before in history have we had a skyscraper collapse due to fire, but say in a wood frame building, it'll collapse with large, gradual deformations. The building will fall over asymmetrically, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. That's important. So let's compare the features of a fire's collapse to the Twin Towers and the third skyscraper on 9/11. Let's see what we would expect a fire to do in a steel frame building. After all, there's been tests that have been done in England, in Cardington in 1995.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, that's 9/11 that he's referring to there. Do we think this is important background research? This was not brought forward by NIST, and these buildings are not even fireproof, these beams. And yet, no failure whatsoever, just simple sagging. We'll come back to that, but there's been many fires in high-rise buildings, up to 6 hours on 5 floors in New York. In Los Angeles, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, we have 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these collapsed. They're remodeled, they're in use today. This is a very important background research that sets a precedent for telling us what is likely to have happened really at the Twin Towers and Building 7. These buildings fell over in a natural collapse, in this case earthquakes, but could be hurricanes also. And we see the building at the bottom. It's relatively intact, it's certainly damaged, but the individual structural elements are not dismembered from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So we'll compare these buildings, which collapsed naturally, to the Twin Towers and others. As we will these also. Explosions. We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds of smoke and dust with solids, pulverized building solids, mostly concrete, suspended in the air. So the word pyroclastic comes from volcanoes, where you have this thick mass of highly differentiated, solidified solids suspended in the air between the clouds and the air outside. You'll see this it's very interesting in the Twin Towers. Now there's hot gases in here that are fueling the expansion, rapid expansion of these clouds in a cauliflower-like manner. This is incredible heat that's producing this phenomenon. We also have witnesses that hear the sounds of explosions. They see the flashes of light. Now these are pretty clear, identifiable characteristics. Let's keep them in mind and see if we have any of these in the World Trade Center destruction. We have typical controlled demolitions where explosions are harnessed to do the destruction very systematically. Let's take a look at those features because we have hundreds of examples from all across the country to make our comparisons. Because it's the most commonly used method to demolish high-rise structures. So this is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives.